What if I told you the 1990s quietly produced some of the smartest science fiction animation ever made, and then pulled the plug before most of us even realized what we had? 13 criminally underrated 90s sci-fi cartoons that ended too soon isn't just a nostalgia trip, it's a case file, a record of bold ideas, serialized risks, and ambitious storytelling that networks didn't fully understand. These weren't shallow toy commercials, they were worlds, and we barely got to explore them. Yes, the title sounds ridiculous. 3 anthropomorphic mice, leather jackets, motorcycles, from Mars. It would have been easy to dismiss this as another attempt to ride the post-Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles wave, and on the surface, it absolutely looked like that. Flashy bikes, catchphrases, action figures waiting to happen. But underneath the chrome and cheese jokes, there was actual mythology. Mars wasn't just a throwaway origin story. It was a conquered world. The villains, the Plutarchians, weren't generic monsters. They were corporate resource vampires draining planets for profit. Earth wasn't random. It was next on the menu. That environmental and anti-corporate undercurrent gave the series more bite than people remember. Throttle, Vinny, and Modo weren't interchangeable heroes either. Each had personality edges that shaped the team dynamic. Modo carried visible scars and a mechanical arm, visual proof that battles had consequences. The show didn't dwell on trauma, but it didn't pretend it didn't exist. Chicago served as a grounded battleground. The recurring human allies weren't helpless mascots. They were participants in resistance. The stakes felt larger than episodic villain-of-the-week skirmishes. And then there was the tone. It balanced humor without undercutting danger. It embraced ridiculousness without collapsing into parody. That's a harder line to walk than it looks. So why didn't it explode into a long-running empire? Timing. The mid-90s were saturated with anthropomorphic action teams. Networks were flooded with claws, tails, and leather jackets. When everything looks extreme, nothing stands out. Toy shelves became battlegrounds. Only the most dominant brands survived. Ratings weren't disastrous, but they weren't unstoppable. And in that era, good enough rarely guaranteed longevity. It ran 3 seasons, which sounds respectable, until you realize the narrative world hinted at expansion far beyond what we saw. Mars remained mostly mythic. The broader interplanetary conflict never fully escalated. The series ended before its universe matured. Today, the concept feels strangely modern. Corporate extraction villains, environmental collapse themes, scrappy resistance fighters. That blueprint would thrive on streaming right now. Instead, it became a cult memory, a show people vaguely recall until they rewatch it and realize it was smarter than it had any right to be. It wasn't a joke. It was a war story in biker helmets, and we barely scratched the surface. Post-apocalyptic Earth, dinosaurs roaming freely, mutant factions fighting for dominance. That premise alone should have guaranteed at least 5 seasons. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs adapted the cult comic series Xenozoic Tales, and unlike many adaptations of the time, it didn't sand down the rough edges too much. The world felt sun-scorched and unstable. Civilization had fractured. Technology was half-remembered relic. Nature had reclaimed control in unpredictable ways. Jack Tenrec wasn't a wisecracking mascot hero. He was stubborn, idealistic, and fiercely protective of ecological balance. His reverence for dinosaurs wasn't novelty, it was philosophical. The show treated prehistoric creatures not as monsters, but as rightful inhabitants of a damaged planet. That environmental thread ran through everything. Villains weren't just power-hungry tyrants. Many represented exploitation, mining interests, military opportunists, political manipulators trying to weaponize the chaos. The show quietly asked, if humanity nearly destroyed the world once, why should it be trusted again? Visually, it leaned into earthy tones and textured landscapes. The dinosaurs weren't cartoon blobs, they were rendered with surprising care. Action sequences carried weight. There was dust, there was scale, there was a sense of genuine danger. And yet, 13 episodes, that's it. 1 short season. Why? Marketing confusion played a role. It wasn't silly enough for very young viewers. It wasn't edgy enough for teens. It lived in an awkward middle ground that networks didn't know how to position. Toy potential existed, but it never exploded into must-have status. The early 90s were also hyper-competitive. Jurassic Park dominated dinosaur culture in live-action cinema. Smaller animated entries struggled to compete with that massive shadow. But the cancellation feels especially frustrating because the world-building was just beginning. Political tensions were escalating. Factions were forming. The philosophical divide between preservation and exploitation was deepening. It felt like the opening act of a much larger saga. Instead, it froze in time. Rewatch it now, and the themes feel eerily current. Environmental collapse, resource wars, distrust of power structures. It wasn't loud about its message. It embedded it within adventure. That subtlety may have cost it longevity. But subtle doesn't mean insignificant. It means the show respected its audience enough not to shout. And sometimes, respect doesn't get renewed. On paper, it looked like a joke. A team of genetically enhanced monkeys flying through space to fight a cosmic virus. That description alone sounds like something designed to sell lunchboxes. But Captain Simian and the Space Monkeys was far more self-aware than its premise suggested. The humor operated on two levels. Younger viewers got slapstick and exaggerated personalities. Older viewers caught the satire, sharp references to classic science fiction, subtle commentary on bureaucracy, and surprisingly thoughtful character arcs. Captain Simian himself wasn't just a goofy commander. He was idealistic to a fault, often clashing with more pragmatic members of his crew. The team dynamic felt lived in rather than randomly assembled. Conflicts weren't always external. Sometimes the real tension came from philosophical disagreements about leadership and responsibility. And the animation style stood out too. It leaned slightly toward anime-inspired movement during action sequences, giving it more fluidity than many Western shows of the time. Space battles felt kinetic. Alien designs were imaginative without being chaotic. And then there was the nebula. The virus-like cosmic entity they were hunting wasn't just a monster of the week gimmick. It symbolized contamination and corruption spreading across systems. The threat felt abstract, yet personal. It allowed for episodes that were genuinely eerie. So why did it vanish? Syndication placement hurt it. Inconsistent time slots made building a stable audience difficult. The show's tonal balance, smart but silly, philosophical yet playful, confused marketing departments that preferred simpler labels. It ran for a single season. 1. Despite critical praise and a loyal niche following, it never received the runway needed to evolve. The writing suggested long-term narrative potential. Seeds were planted for arcs that never bloomed. If this series debuted today, it would likely thrive on a streaming platform that rewards layered humor and serialized sci-fi. In the mid-90s broadcast ecosystem, however, nuance was often collateral damage. That's what makes its cancellation sting. It wasn't a failed experiment. It was an unfinished one. Here's the twist nobody expected. The animated spin-off was better than the blockbuster film. After the divisive live-action movie hit theaters, expectations were low. Many assumed the cartoon adaptation would be a diluted extension designed purely to salvage merchandise momentum. Instead, more Godzilla. The series corrected course. The premise followed the surviving offspring of the cinematic creature, now bonded to scientist Nick Tatopoulos and his research team. That dynamic allowed the show to explore global threats without turning Godzilla into a mindless force of destruction. The structure leaned into investigative science fiction. Each episode introduced new mutations, cryptids, or mysterious phenomena. It often felt like a hybrid of kaiju spectacle and procedural mystery. The writing respected continuity. Recurring villains appeared. Technology evolved. Relationships shifted. It wasn't a static monster showcase. It was an expanding universe. Visually, the action delivered scale that Saturday morning lineups rarely achieved. Buildings crumbled with weight. Creatures towered with presence. But Godzilla himself moved with agility that live-action budgets couldn't always replicate convincingly. Most importantly, it restored dignity to the franchise in the eyes of many fans. And yet, 2 seasons. Despite strong ratings on Fox Kids, the show didn't receive long-term network investment. Corporate restructuring and shifting programming strategies altered priorities. When networks pivot, even successful properties can lose footing. The timing was brutal. The late 90s marked transitions in children's television, with increased competition from cable channels and anime imports gaining traction. Maintaining momentum required aggressive backing. The series finale provided closure, but it didn't feel like exhaustion. It felt like interruption. Looking back, but this show demonstrated that adaptation missteps can be corrected with thoughtful writing. It expanded lore. It honored the spirit of kaiju storytelling. It gave audiences something sturdier than spectacle. And just as it found its rhythm, it stopped. Sometimes redemption arcs deserve more than 2 seasons. This one certainly did. A boy with a red cap opens a portal and accidentally steps into cosmic horror. That's not exaggeration. Mighty Max started as a toy line about pocket-sized playsets. It could have been harmless adventure fluff. Instead, it evolved into dimension-hopping science fiction layered with mythology, monsters, and destiny-driven prophecy. Max wasn't some chosen hero with perfect instincts. He was impulsive, emotional, often overwhelmed, and the show made him grow through fear rather than bravado. His companions, Norman, the Viking warrior, and Virgil, the foul-mouthed avian sage, brought humor and gravitas without diluting the stakes. And the stakes were real. The series leaned heavily into serialized storytelling. Episodes built toward a looming confrontation with Skullmaster, a villain who wasn't just evil for convenience. He represented ancient, almost Lovecraftian forces bent on unraveling existence. That's intense material for a mid-90s animated slot. There were timelines, alternate futures, moral compromises, sacrifices, and then came the finale. Instead of a safe reset, the show delivered one of the boldest endings in children's animation, a time loop twist that erased events while implying sacrifice and rebirth. It wasn't neat, it wasn't comforting. It demanded interpretation. You would think a series willing to take that kind of narrative risk would earn more seasons. It didn't. 2 seasons, 40 episodes. Done. Toy sales never matched the ambition of the writing. Retail performance once again influenced longevity. When merchandise drives funding, storytelling depth becomes secondary. The cancellation felt abrupt because the mythology hinted at further expansion. The universe was bigger than the episodes we received. Threads dangled. The cosmic hierarchy remained partially unexplored. Rewatching it today, the tone feels shockingly mature. It didn't talk down to its audience. It assumed kids could handle complex themes about fate and responsibility. Maybe that assumption cost it mainstream dominance, but it's also why people still talk about it. Mighty Max wasn't just a toy commercial. It was serialized multiverse storytelling before the multiverse became trendy, and it deserved to finish what it started. A teenage genius creates advanced robots. A corporate tyrant wants to control them. Society stands on the brink of automated domination. Sound familiar? That's because the bots master predicted anxieties we're living with right now. The protagonist, Ziv Z.Z. Zoolander, wasn't a generic kid inventor. He was sharp, sarcastic, and deeply suspicious of unchecked power. His robots weren't comic relief props. They had distinct personalities and moral awareness. The show framed artificial intelligence not just as cool machinery, but as a philosophical responsibility. The antagonist, Lazarus Slade, wasn't some mystical warlord. He was a media-savvy corporate mogul aiming to consolidate control through robotics and surveillance. His motivations felt disturbingly grounded. Power, influence, ownership of infrastructure. Episodes tackled themes of autonomy, free will, and technological ethics without wrapping them in neon absurdity. There were action sequences, yes, but beneath the surface ran a consistent tension about who should control innovation. Visually, the show carried a sleek aesthetic. Metallic environments, streamlined bots, and urban backdrops that hinted at a society on the edge of transformation. So why didn't it last? Syndication fragmentation damaged its consistency. Without a stable network identity, it struggled to anchor itself in viewers' weekly routines. Marketing leaned heavily into the robot action while underplaying the layered storytelling. It ran for one season. That's it. Despite episodes that hinted at escalating corporate conflict and deeper conspiracies, the narrative simply halted. There was room for evolution, for ZZ to grow into a larger resistance figure, for Slade's empire to expand, for the bots themselves to confront their place in society. Instead, the experiment ended before it could mature. Watching it now feels eerie. Discussions about surveillance capitalism, AI ethics, and corporate consolidation dominate modern headlines. This show explored those fears decades ago, packaged inside a format most executives likely dismissed as mechanical spectacle. It wasn't spectacle, it was warning, and the fact that it vanished so quickly makes it feel even more prophetic. But sometimes the most forward-thinking stories disappear, not because they failed, but because they arrived too early. Imagine creating one of the strangest, fastest-paced sci-fi comedies of the decade, and then airing it so erratically that no one can keep up with it. That was Project G.E.E.K.E.R. On the surface, it followed an absurd premise. A mutated, indestructible alien creature named G.E.E.K.E.R. escapes from a laboratory and becomes the most sought-after biological specimen in the galaxy. Scientists want him. Military forces want him. Criminals want him. But the show never played that straight. It leaned hard into chaotic humor, rapid-fire jokes, sudden visual gags, dialogue that swerved unpredictably. It felt closer to cult animation than safe Saturday morning fare. But the tone bounced between slapstick absurdity and surprisingly sharp satire of corporate greed and scientific overreach. The supporting cast amplified that unpredictability. Lady Macbeth, the bioengineered protector assigned to guard G.E.E.K.E.R., carried a stoic intensity that clashed hilariously with the creature's oblivious energy. The villains weren't menacing in a traditional sense. They were exaggerated reflections of authority figures obsessed with ownership and control. And underneath the humor, there was real science fiction structure, genetic experimentation, government contracts, weaponized research. The world-building existed. It was just wrapped in chaos. The animation style embraced exaggerated expressions and kinetic movement, giving scenes a manic rhythm that made it feel ahead of its time. It wasn't polished in the glossy way networks preferred, but it was distinctive. So what went wrong? Scheduling sabotage. Episodes aired out of order. Time slots shifted unpredictably. Viewers trying to follow the narrative were left confused. Serialized elements lost coherence because the broadcast plan undercut the structure. Marketing also struggled to define it. Was it a creature comedy? A sci-fi satire? A slapstick chase series? Without a clear promotional angle, it drifted. It lasted one season, 13 episodes, and then silence. What makes its cancellation particularly frustrating is how well this style would fit modern animation landscapes. Streaming audiences now celebrate offbeat humor and unconventional pacing. Shows that once would have been labeled too weird are now embraced as fresh. Project G.E.E.K.E.R. was weird. Intentionally weird. Confidently weird. It didn't flatten its identity to fit expectations. It trusted its audience to keep up. In the mid-90s broadcast ecosystem, that trust wasn't rewarded. Today, it feels like a lost prototype for the kind of irreverent, sci-fi-leaning animation that thrives online. It wasn't canceled because it lacked imagination. It was canceled because it had too much of it. And sometimes, in television history, that's the most frustrating reason of all. An alien armada descends on Earth. Governments collapse, cities fall, civilians flee, and this aired in prime time. Invasion America was not built like a typical animated series. Backed by Steven Spielberg's name, it carried a cinematic weight that felt intentionally different from Saturday morning programming. But the tone was sober. The stakes were national. The invasion unfolded with a sense of creeping inevitability rather than cartoon chaos. The protagonist, David Carter, wasn't a wisecracking hero. He was a young man discovering that he was half alien and central to a planetary conflict. That revelation didn't empower him overnight. It isolated him. Trust fractured. Loyalties blurred. The aliens themselves weren't colorful monsters with gimmicks. They were militaristic, calculating, organized. Their arrival felt strategic. Communications failed. Infrastructure buckled. The series portrayed invasion as systemic destabilization rather than flashy destruction. And here's what made it bold. It serialized the war. Each episode advanced the conflict. Territory shifted. Resistance movements formed. Characters made decisions that altered trajectories. There was no comfortable reset button at the end of the week. For late 90s American television, that structure was risky. Animation was still widely associated with episodic comfort. Networks expected drop-in accessibility. Invasion America demanded commitment. It ran for 13 episodes, and then it ended on a cliffhanger. No gradual conclusion, no clean victory, just an unresolved war hanging in the air. Despite strong initial promotion, ratings declined after the premiere event. Primetime animation carried financial pressure. When viewership didn't sustain blockbuster levels, renewal became unlikely. But here's the frustrating part. The foundation had been laid. Political intrigue was expanding. The alien hierarchy remained partially unexplored. David's internal conflict was only beginning to mature. And the narrative promised escalation. Instead, it froze mid-battle. Rewatching it now, the tone feels startlingly contemporary. Serialized alien invasion stories thrive on streaming platforms. Audiences embrace long-form arcs. Slow-burn war narratives now feel normal. In 1998, that appetite wasn't yet proven. Invasion America didn't fail because it lacked ambition. It ended because it asked the network to commit to ambition. And commitment is expensive. Two ex-military mechanics build a jet in a scrapyard. That alone tells you this wasn't subtle. SWAT cats blasted onto screens with aggressive energy. Megacat City felt industrial and volatile. Sirens wailed. Skies burned orange. And villains didn't just rob banks. They unleashed kaiju-sized threats and experimental weapons. The action sequences were intense. Missiles launched. Buildings shattered. Dogfights dominated entire episodes. The animation team treated aerial combat with cinematic seriousness. Every dive and evasive maneuver carried momentum. But beneath the spectacle sat a surprisingly disciplined structure. T-Bone and Razor weren't reckless vigilantes. They were tactical. They analyzed threats. They improvised under pressure. Their partnership felt grounded in mutual respect rather than comic rivalry. Recurring antagonists built continuity. The villain roster expanded strategically instead of randomly. Megacat City developed personality as a living environment rather than a static backdrop. So why cancel something that looked this strong? Cost. High-quality action animation isn't cheap. Complex sequences demand time and resources. As production expenses rose, financial calculations shifted. Network priorities also evolved, leaning toward programming perceived as safer or less violent. The show lasted 2 seasons, then it stopped, and the cancellation wasn't quiet. Fans noticed. Ratings were solid. Merchandising had traction. The creative team reportedly had plans for deeper arcs involving the city's political infrastructure and expanded villain mythology. Instead, the runway ended early. Looking back, SWAT Cats feels like a bridge between eras, combining high-octane spectacle with serialized character growth. It carried the energy of blockbuster cinema in an animated format before that approach became standard. Today, it would likely anchor a streaming platform as an action flagship. In 1993, it may have been too intense for shifting broadcast standards. It wasn't canceled because it lacked audience enthusiasm. It was canceled because sustaining that scale required risk. And risk, in children's programming of the early 90s, was rarely tolerated for long. Before CGI animation was polished, before serialized war arcs were normal, Before kids' television embraced long-form military science fiction, there was Roughnecks. This wasn't a safe adaptation. It leaned directly into the brutal interstellar war against the arachnids. Soldiers deployed to hostile planets. Missions failed. Command decisions carried weight. Casualties mattered. The structure was bold. Instead of standalone episodes, the show organized itself into campaign arcs, planet by planet, operation by operation. Each arc advanced the war. Promotions changed authority. Tactical mistakes reshaped strategy. That format was way ahead of broadcast standards. The CGI, while dated now, was ambitious for 1999 television. Armor suits felt mechanical. Dropships had mass. Battlefields weren't colorful playgrounds. They were hostile terrain. Tone-wise, it refused to sanitize war completely. It didn't glamorize sacrifice. It showed exhaustion. It showed doubt. It allowed characters to question leadership decisions. And then, it just stopped. Not because ratings imploded. Not because audiences rejected it. Production costs became the issue. CGI animation in the late 90s was expensive. Rendering pipelines were slow. Budget pressures mounted. The final planned arc was never completed. The war never truly concluded. That unfinished campaign gives the series a strange legacy. It feels like an interrupted military dispatch. A transmission cut mid-conflict. Revisit it today, and you see a prototype for modern serialized sci-fi animation. Structured arcs, tactical realism, emotional continuity. It didn't lack audience potential. It lacked financial runway. And that distinction matters, because Roughnecks didn't burn out creatively. It ran out of resources. A post-apocalyptic Earth. Bioengineered creatures. A teenage girl built to be a weapon. That's Cyber-9. New Dawn. And almost nobody talks about it. The world had already ended. Cities were ruins. Technology had merged with organic mutation. Humanity survived in scattered factions while a tyrant named Machestro controlled armies of monstrous hybrids. And then there was Cyber-9. She wasn't born. She was engineered. Designed to be the ultimate weapon against Machestro's regime. That origin alone created tension. Was she human? Was she property? Was she destiny? The series didn't treat her as invincible. She struggled. She doubted. She reacted emotionally to violence instead of shrugging it off. Her team wasn't comic relief. They were survivors navigating trauma in a broken world. What made the show stand out was tone. It felt darker than its time slot suggested. The atmosphere carried grit. The ruins weren't colorful playgrounds. They felt abandoned, haunted, dangerous. The animation blended Western structure with anime-inspired intensity. Fight choreography had weight. Mutant designs were unsettling without becoming grotesque. And here's the frustrating part. It only ran for one season, 13 episodes. The story was clearly building toward a larger confrontation. Machestro's empire felt expandable. The moral question of engineered identity was barely explored. Then it vanished. Part of the issue was branding confusion. The toy line underperformed. Marketing didn't clearly communicate whether it was post-apocalyptic action, biohorror, or teen hero drama. Without a dominant hook, it struggled to anchor itself in a crowded late 90s market. But rewatch it now, and it feels like something that would thrive on streaming. Serialized dystopia? Genetic experimentation themes? Strong female lead wrestling with manufactured destiny? That blueprint works today. In 1999, it didn't receive the support it needed. Cyber-9 wasn't canceled because it lacked direction. It ended because it arrived at the wrong moment in television evolution. And that's what makes it criminally underrated. What happens when you take a pulp hero from the 1930s and throw him into a collapsing cyberpunk future? You get Phantom 2040, and almost no one was prepared for it. This was not a simple hero versus villain adventure. The world of 21st century Metropia was crumbling under environmental decay, corporate dominance, and social stratification. Skyscrapers pierced polluted skies, while forgotten populations struggled below. The atmosphere felt dense, layered, almost oppressive. The Phantom himself was not a quip machine. He was a reluctant inheritor of legacy, wrestling with responsibility while navigating a society shaped by corruption. His enemies weren't just masked criminals. They were conglomerates, political machines, and systems designed to exploit. Visually, the series leaned into angular architecture and moody color palettes. It embraced a near-anime fluidity that distinguished it from brighter, more toyetic contemporaries. The soundtrack carried an industrial edge that amplified the dystopian tone. Most importantly, the narrative refused to reset. Choices altered trajectories. Revelations reframed earlier events. Secondary characters carried motives that unfolded gradually. It demanded attention in an era that favored episodic convenience. But attention was exactly what it struggled to secure. The complexity that made it fascinating also made it harder to market. New younger viewers expecting straightforward action sometimes encountered philosophical debates about identity and power. Advertisers seeking light escapism encountered layered political commentary. Networks juggling scheduling blocks treated it like just another entry in a lineup, rather than as a serialized arc requiring consistent time slots. 40 episodes aired. That sounds generous until you realize how much larger the vision appeared to be. Story threads hinted at expansions that never materialized. The show concluded, but it never felt as if it had exhausted its thematic potential. In hindsight, Phantom 2040 resembles a bridge between eras. It carried the DNA of classic comic mythology, while gesturing toward the morally intricate storytelling that would define later animated hits. It trusted its audience to grapple with ambiguity rather than spoon-feeding simple lessons. When it ended, there was no explosive controversy, no dramatic scandal, just a quiet fade. And sometimes that's worse, because quiet endings often mean bold ideas slipped through the cracks without the industry realizing what it had nearly nurtured. If dystopian superhero animation has a forgotten pioneer, it stands there, masked, vigilant, and prematurely retired. This wasn't just ambitious, it was revolutionary. Exosquad placed children inside a solar system-wide war fueled by genetic engineering, colonial exploitation, and ideological extremism. The Neo-Sapiens weren't simple villains. They were artificially created beings rising against systemic oppression. Humanity wasn't portrayed as morally pure. But leadership faltered. Politics fractured. The series committed to serialized storytelling long before it became fashionable. Characters aged emotionally. Trust eroded. Soldiers died and stayed dead. War carried consequence. Loss reshaped strategy. Dialogue often felt closer to prime-time drama than to toy-driven animation. The exoframes weren't flashy gimmicks. They were military hardware deployed with tactical intent. Battles unfolded with strategic tension rather than exaggerated spectacle. Season 2 escalated everything. Occupation regimes, resistance movements, propaganda campaigns, ethical dilemmas about power and survival. It treated its audience as capable of understanding nuance, and that nuance may have sealed its fate. Toy sales underperformed. Or merchandise revenue, often the true decider in 90s animation, failed to match the show's narrative ambition. Ratings were respectable but not explosive. Networks measured profitability through retail, not thematic depth. 2 seasons. 52 episodes. And then silence. No soft reboot. No watered-down continuation. Just an unfinished epic paused mid-universe. Rewatch it now, and it feels like a precursor to prestige serialized animation, political complexity, moral ambiguity, long-form arcs. Everything modern streaming audiences celebrate was already present. It simply arrived too early. Exosquad didn't get canceled because it lacked imagination. It ended because it operated at a level the broadcast ecosystem wasn't built to sustain. That's why it sits at number 1. Not just underrated, not just short-lived, criminally ahead of its time. 13 worlds, 13 cancellations. and not one of them deserved to fade this quietly. These weren't disposable cartoons. They were blueprints for the kind of serialized, intelligent sci-fi we celebrate today. Maybe they arrived too early. Maybe networks didn't see the future, but we did. And if you remember them too, you know exactly why this still feels like a loss.